Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Furlong, and today we're talking fermentation. In the last video, we looked at the process of cell respiration. That's when organisms could extract energy from a glucose molecule and use that energy to keep them alive. But that's not the only way that organisms can get energy. There's another way called fermentation, and this takes place in the absence of oxygen. And so here you can see, let me put myself here in the middle of this winery as I'm walking down. Hello everybody. And inside of these barrels there was various types of fruits that were smashed down. It contains a lot of sugar. They put some yeast in those barrels, and right now those yeast are eating up all that sugar, and they are going through the process of fermentation in an effort to make some wine. And we'll take a look at how that process is happening here. Let's first take a quick review of cell respiration. I'll recall that there were three stages. First we had glycolysis, where glucose is broken down into two molecules of pyruvate. It then goes through the Krebs cycle, and all those NADHs and FADH2s that were made in glycolysis in the Krebs cycle head on over to the electron transport, and we can get 36 ATPs. Well, let's take a look at what happens if there isn't any oxygen. Here is our glucose molecule. Again, it's just going to be shown by our 6-carbon molecule. And so, again, recall that there would be hydrogens and oxygens attached to all those carbon atoms. We're just not showing them for simplicity's sake. And an ATP is going to be used up in this process, forming ADP. The glucose is going to undergo a couple more reactions. Another ATP is going to be used up, forming ADP. And so an enzyme is going to come along and cut that glucose into two pieces, two 3-carbon molecules. It's going to undergo a series of reactions where an NAD plus is going to steal away a little bit of energy to become NADH, and then two ADPs become two ATPs, once again forming pyruvate. Now, if we look at what has been made here, we've ultimately got 4 ATPs made, but remember we had to use up 2 ATPs, so our net gain is still 2 ATPs. Notice nothing is different in this first part of fermentation as in cell respiration because it's glycolysis. It's the same process that's taking place. What's going to happen now are those two molecules of pyruvate, because there's no oxygen, is going to undergo a series of reactions similar to that intermediate step, but there's a couple of crucial differences. So let's take a look at what's happening to the pyruvate. It's going to undergo a chemical reaction. A carbon dioxide molecule is going to be released. So now we have a 2-carbon molecule. In another reaction, a water molecule is being released. But here's where the difference comes in. Now, as this 2-carbon molecule undergoes a series of chemical reactions, and NADH, the same ones that were made in glycolysis, are going to be used up, forming NAD+, which will then be used in glycolysis again. What we end up with, though, are two 2-carbon molecules, not acetate, however. It depends on the organism. So here, what happens, because of that slight chemical reaction that was different, in some organisms, that 2-carbon molecule is now called ethanol. Ethanol is the actual name for alcohol. This is drinking alcohol. So those yeast that were in those barrels, they're producing alcohol in those barrels, making wine. This is how beer is made. This is how liquor is made, by using microorganisms. Depending on the amount of sugar that is put in there, along with how many yeast are put in there, can determine the alcohol content then. So basically what happens is that these yeast will continue to produce alcohol. There'll be so much alcohol that the yeast will die, and then you just take those old yeast out and you have an alcoholic beverage. Right? But that doesn't happen in animals. We don't produce alcohol. Now we go through that same process, but it's slightly different. Instead, we have lactic acid that's being made. So lactic acid builds up in places like our muscles. This is where we use most of our energy in our muscles. I'm sure you've experienced this before. If lactic acid begins to build up in our muscles, it's going to do two things. One, it attaches to our pain receptor, so our muscles start to hurt. But the other thing is, pretty soon, we're not going to have enough ATPs for our muscles to contract. And we can temporarily lose that ability. We say that we have muscle fatigue. Or more commonly, we say that our muscles are cramping up. So if you've ever woke up in the middle of the night with a Charlie horse and your muscles are cramping, your calf is aching, that's what's happening. It's a lack of oxygen to those muscle cells. You've probably experienced this when you're running, especially, you get that stitch in your side. That is your diaphragm that's cramping up, all because of a buildup of lactic acid. We also have a lot of lactic acid buildup in our large intestine, in our colon. There's all kinds of bacteria that are growing in there. Imagine if they were producing alcoholic fermentation and were producing ethanol. Why, we would constantly have alcohol in our blood system if that was the case. Anyways, let's talk about something else. Let's just really quickly compare these two processes of how we can get energy from food. One is cell respiration, the other is fermentation. So we'll just make a quick Venn diagram here. First of all, what are some of the differences? Well, cell respiration uses oxygen and fermentation doesn't use any oxygen. And that's going to determine the path that this glucose is ultimately going to take. In cell respiration, remember, we get a grand total of 36 ATPs. The net gain for fermentation is only 2. For some organisms like yeast that are single-celled, 2 ATPs is plenty for them to live on. But for multicellular organisms like us, we have to have that 36. We can't survive on fermentation taking place. And of course, in most organisms, they produce alcohol as a byproduct. Of course, in us, that would be lactic acid. The only byproducts we see in cell respiration is carbon dioxide and water that we exhale, so nothing dangerous there. How are these two things alike? Well, they are both ways that we can extract energy, and all organisms have this ability. Even bacteria can carry out cell respiration. Even though they don't have mitochondria in their membranes, they have these same enzymes that allow them to carry out the Krebs cycle and electron transport. Kind of fascinating, really. In both of them, it can start with glucose. Now, here's the thing. We don't have to start with glucose. We could actually use fats. We can use proteins for this process, but glucose is the most commonly used organic compound for energy. And then lastly, in both cases, carbon dioxide is being made as a byproduct. So I hope that you found this series on energy extraction useful to you, and I'll see you in class.